Back in 1962, two of Asia's giants, China and India, went to war. It was this short, brutal conflict fought on the literal roof of the world. And you know what? The shockwaves are still being felt today. But to really get why it happened, we've got to look way beyond just the battlefield. So, how on earth did it come to this? I mean, these two weren't ancient enemies, far from it. They were two massive, newly independent nations that started off as friends. We're going to dig into the story of how that friendship completely unraveled and turned into an all-out war. October 20th, 1962. That's the day the peace shattered. All of a sudden, the remote, icy peaks of the Himalayas became a war zone. And this wasn't some slow burn escalation. It was a sudden, coordinated attack that caught a lot of people completely off guard. All right, let's start at the beginning. We're looking at the outbreak of the war, and this is a story defined not just by politics, but by the insane challenges of the environment itself. Just try to wrap your head around this number. 4,250 meters. That's the dizzying altitude we're talking about. This was one of the highest altitude conflicts in history. So the soldiers, they weren't just fighting each other, they were battling freezing temperatures and thin, oxygen-starved air. It was a logistical and physical nightmare, plain and simple. Okay, to really get to the why, we need to rewind the clock a bit. This war didn't just pop up out of nowhere. No, it was the climax of a whole decade of tension that poisoned what was once a really promising friendship. You can really see the complete 180 in the relationship right here. It all started with so much goodwill. India, under Prime Minister Nehru, was one of the very first non-communist countries to recognize Mao's China. But that friendship got steadily chipped away by three big things: unresolved borders, China's actions in Tibet, and the real kicker, India giving asylum to the Dalai Lama. So here's how things escalated. It really kicks off in 1950 when China moves into Tibet, suddenly creating this massive shared border. Then maps start coming out of Beijing that claim chunks of territory India thought was its own. But the real breaking point was 1959. The Tibetan uprising is crushed and the Dalai Lama flees to India. For China, this was a massive provocation. By the time they got to the negotiating table, both sides had dug in their heels and diplomacy was pretty much doomed to fail. But hey, this wasn't just a regional squabble. You have to remember, all of this was playing out right in the heart of the Cold War. The rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union was casting a long, long shadow over the Himalayas. So check out the geopolitical chessboard here. India was in this really unique spot, officially non-aligned, but friendly with both Washington and Moscow. Now for China, which had tense relations with both superpowers, this was, well, it was deeply worrying. Beijing was terrified that India was becoming part of a strategic encirclement, basically a pawn that the US and the Soviets would use to contain China. With diplomacy failing and geopolitical fears mounting, the talking stopped. It was time for the situation to finally boil over into open warfare. The war itself was brutally efficient and very short. On October 20th, China's People's Liberation Army, the PLA, launched this massive two-pronged attack. They were well prepared and they quickly overwhelmed the Indian forces. But then, almost as quickly as it started, it was over. Just 1 month later, China declared a unilateral ceasefire and, in a really surprising move, pulled its troops back to their pre-war positions. Let's be crystal clear about this. On the battlefield, there was a definite winner. China achieved all of its military objectives, decisively and quickly. For India, it was a shocking and deeply humiliating defeat. But the story doesn't end with a ceasefire, not by a long shot. A 1-month war fought over 60 years ago has had a profound and lasting impact on both nations and the entire region. So let's look at the fallout. The aftermath was, well, complicated. You could argue that while China won the military battle, it lost the political one by being seen as the aggressor. The conflict also shattered the myth of communist solidarity because the Soviet Union actually sided with India, which deepened the Sino-Soviet split. For India, this defeat was a massive wake-up call, kicking off a huge military modernization program. It also pushed India closer to the United States and left it feeling abandoned by its partners in the non-aligned movement, that group of nations that had promised to stay neutral in the Cold War. So, decades later in the 90s, the two countries did sign agreements to maintain peace along the border. And while those have largely prevented another full-scale war, they never actually solved the root problem. The fundamental disagreement over where the border actually is, that was never settled. And that brings us right up to today, leaving us with this really critical question. With tensions flaring up again along that same border in recent years, the legacy of 1962 serves as a stark reminder. It forces us to ask, is a peace built on unresolved issues truly permanent, or is the roof of the world just waiting for the next storm?